evening, everyone, and welcome to this Festival of Ideas talk on health inequalities from Roman Britain to COVID Britain. My name's Karen Bloor. I'm a professor in the Department of Health Sciences at the University of York. Before we get started, just a few technical notes. If you're watching live, you can ask questions using the Q&A button on your screen. This is available throughout the events, so questions can be asked at any time. Should you have any technical issues, if you lose your Wi-Fi or anything like that, please rejoin the event using the original link. Please remember that today's event is being recorded. You'll be able to watch again and recommend it to your friends. Subtitles are available. To turn these on or off, use the CC Live Transcript button, which should be on the bottom right of your screen. So I'm delighted first to introduce our speakers. We have two speakers this evening. We're going to have a talk on inequalities in Roman Britain first, and then questions from you. And then we'll move on to more modern times and have our second speaker on COVID Britain. And again, some more chance for questions and answers at the end of the session. So our first speaker, Ellen Kendall, is a postdoctoral researcher at the Bioarchaeology Research Group in the Department of Archaeology, University of Durham. She recently completed a pilot study of the history of health inequality in Britain, involving collaboration with archaeologists, economists, epidemiologists, and social historians from the universities of Durham and York. And her wider research interests include the childhood origins of population health and biosocial influences on health. Richard Cookson is a professor at the Centre for Health Economics at the University of York. He has helped to pioneer equity-informative research methods, providing decision makers with information about how to reduce health inequalities, including methods of distributional cost-effectiveness analysis, health equity monitoring for healthcare, and methods for investigating public concerns about health inequality. He has co-chaired various international working groups on equity in health, and he's worked in the Prime Minister's Delivery Unit and on various advisory committees. So remember that you can ask questions at any time during the session, and we're looking forward to hearing from you. And without further ado, let me hand over to Dr. Kendall for our first talk.
Thank you very much, Karen. I'm very pleased to be here today. I'm going to be talking about health inequality between the Roman period and the later Victorian period. I just need to do a little bit of a heads up. There will be images of human remains in here, so if that is problematic for you, just to be aware that that is on the way. I'm going to be talking about perspectives that we can gain from bioarchaeology to help us understand how health inequality has played out in the past and what we can take from that to understand where we are currently to some extent. Before I get started, I just want to give some acknowledgements. I did this work as part of a team along with Richard Cookson, who is a health economist. I've also worked with Professor Becky Gowland in archaeology, Tim Doran, an epidemiologist, Alex Brown, a historian, and Professor Janet Montgomery, who is a biogeochemist archaeologist. And we have been funded to do this work by the Wellcome Trust and have some thanks to give to various people who have participated in this. Right, the first question, and I won't steal too much of Richard's thunder, is to say what is health inequality and why should we study it? Well, firstly, it's social inequality in health, and that's quite important. Understanding the social element of it is because it is in essence replicating differences in systemic distribution of wealth and power, but it's being embodied in our health. What is health inequality? Firstly, as I said, it is the embodiment of social inequality, and it's producing differences in health. It is systematically related to differences in wealth and power and how those play out in the body and in health. And it's more than just healthcare. In this country, we have a national health service, which is free at the point of service. However, we still have health inequalities. So it is actually much more complex than that. It produces long-term, it's based on long-term causes, but also it produces long-term results. And most people probably don't realize this, but childhood development is actually really important. Early fetal life and early childhood development actually set the tone for health throughout the lifespan. So it's actually very important, the health people experience in childhood. And that's true in bioarchaeology as well as the modern period. So the question, why bioarchaeology? Why should we use bioarchaeology to study health inequalities? And there's several very important reasons for that. Firstly, we're not limited in what we can look at. As long as there are human remains, we can study it. We can go back thousands of years and potentially tens of thousands of years. We can understand the past and shed light on the present and future through this. This can give us unique insights where we don't have written documents for various periods, or the written documents that exist just don't address ordinary people because history has traditionally privileged the people it found most important to write about. Also, bones don't lie. History is subject to being the narrative of the people who write those histories. They tell people what they want people to remember and the narrative that they want passed down. Human remains, on the other hand, record what was. It is that embodiment of a life's experience. And so we get a more accurate idea of what was going on. And finally, it's an opportunity, as our project is showing, for multidisciplinary collaboration. We get perspectives from bioarchaeology, yes, but also from history, from economics, and it can bring to really the strengths of many different disciplines together through looking at bioarchaeological remains and the way we interpret them. So the important thing about this is actually we need to understand history to understand what we're seeing in bones. And so we have built some hypotheses around what we would expect to see in advance of doing bioarchaeological research. Now, we know from the Roman period, it was very hierarchical. And from that, we would expect there to be significant health inequalities. Going into the early medieval period, less of this. And well into the early medieval period, we would expect to see a more even distribution of resources until into the Norman conquest, sorry. Into the later medieval and the early modern period, this looks very, very different. We've got some very big events occurring. We've got growing population, we have plagues, we have famines, we have 10 and 50 respectively % of populations being killed in some of these events. These are significant events that affect the population of the health, but also cause the size of the population to fluctuate. And these have really big impacts, not only for the poor, but also for affluent members of society. So we've got these hypotheses about how we expect health inequality to sort of ebb and flow over time in relation to some of these historic events. And essentially expect it to increase in some regards over time. Now, why we can use human remains to study the past is because skeleton is in fact a living tissue. Now, it's changing all the time. From even before you're born, you are developing your skeleton in the fetal period. Now, there's about 270 bones in a human infant. These fuse to around 206 in the adult skeleton. So there's a lot of change going on during your period of development. Because of that intense period of growth and change, the child's skeleton is actually very, very plastic, very prone to change, very sensitive to environmental influences. And it's growing rapidly. It requires an awful lot of energy for all of that growth. The immune system is developing, and all of this makes children a really sensitive indicator of what's going on in an environment, and that shows in their skeleton. And most people would think of skeletons as Halloween things. They think skeletons are hard. They must be something that stays in a fairly static state. And that's actually not true. It's very active. It's turning over all the time. It's constantly broken down and rebuilt cell by cell to maintain itself. So when we get disease or malnutrition or any sort of state that is a disruption of the normality, it upsets the balance. And so as archaeologists, we will end up seeing bone forming lesions or bone destroying lesions and changes in the normal contour of the bone. A really good example of this is what we would see here in the top of, this is somebody's forehead and the top of their eye sockets. And you can see that sort of spongy honeycomb appearance where it's bulging outward in the top of the eye. This is called criboteratalia, and this is an example of chronic malnutrition. And usually we would attribute this to anemia. And this is really important because actually we don't see short-term conditions in the skeleton. If you were to get sick with the virus and die, we're not going to see that in your skeleton because you haven't lived long enough. It takes time for these changes to take place. So we only see chronic conditions in the skeleton. Things we can see in children or in adults, if we're measuring height, we can see impaired or we can see interrupted growth, lines where growth has been interrupted and resumed afterwards, or children that are small for age, or adults who are small for the expected height of their population. We can also see nutritional deficiencies, not only like criboteratalia, which we would associate with anemia and iron metabolism, but also things like scurvy, which would be vitamin C deficiency, or rickets, which would be associated with vitamin D deficiency. We also get markers of non-specific stress or infection. So we can see bone forming or bone destroying lesions, which are, we call them non-specific because we know there's something going on, it's inflammation or it's infection, but we can't attribute it to a specific cause. And we can also see markers of specific infection. Really good examples of this would be tuberculosis or syphilis that has progressed in the past before they had treatments. Those predict very distinctive lesions, and we can tell what those diseases are. We can also see things like interpersonal violence or occupational hazards. There's very characteristics, injuries associated with interpersonal violence. Usually these are injuries to the face or the upper torso. Occupational hazards might be something like in the Victorian period, women and children who were involved in matchmaking activities were exposed to white phosphorus. They developed something called phossy jaw, where they ended up having a very moth-eaten, their jaw was eaten away by exposure to white phosphorus. So all of these things can tell us about the lives that people were living and what sort of conditions. And these are things we would expect to be different for affluent people versus very poor people. So for this study, we created a long list of bone indicators that we thought might be indicative of differences in health between people of different socioeconomic status. We considered 14 indicators in total. These mainly fell into 3 categories: infection, trauma, or metabolic disorders or nutritional deficiencies. All of these are linked to resource access and environment. We actually end up discarding a lot of these because of a few problems. One of those is that is the healthy survivor effect. So essentially, you have to live long enough with these problems for it to show in your bones. If you die quickly, then you'll look healthy, but you're not, you're dead, unfortunately. So that's a problem that people who live longer, this is longer exposure versus higher risk in adult data. People who died as old adults had a longer life and more chance to form lesions. They may not have had a worse life than somebody who died younger and had less time to form lesions. But also another problem with time is that time heals all wounds, and some bone lesions heal too. Some of these can be erased by healing, and thus we don't see this sort of childhoods people had and the stress that they actually lived under early in life. So what we ended up with is actually 4 final indicators, 2 relating to short-term early childhood and 2 relating to longer-term indicators. Our early childhood indicators are criboteratalia, which you saw earlier, and that's related to anemia. And that only forms in very early childhood. It's only in very early childhood when the skeleton has enough plasticity for this compensation to anemia to occur. The other one is enamel hypoplasia, which is these lines and grooves that you can see on the teeth. This happens when tooth development is interrupted and restarts. The later, longer term indicators we looked at are caries, which most people will know as cavities or tooth decay. This is normally associated with sugar in the diet, and it is, but there is another component to this, and that is immune function. Your immune system keeps the microbiome of your mouth, the bacteria and all of the microbiological things that live in your mouth in check and in a certain balance. If your immune system is dysfunctional, you will be at higher risk of caries. And so immune function does. We know that people who are born premature, for instance, and have some immune dysfunction have a higher risk of caries. So we wanted to look at that. throughout the lifespan. And final adult stature, even though we're measuring this in adults, this actually represents stress during the period of growth. You can do some catching up, and that is important, but overall, people who live under chronic stress tend to be shorter. So for the data, we looked at published and unpublished summary data from reports on pathology from over 11,000 individuals at 33 different archaeological sites in England. They are primarily from the south and east. We covered 4 periods, the Roman, the early medieval, the later medieval, and a post-medieval to Victorian period. For each period, we designated sites that were chosen affluent or poor based on the archaeological or historical contextual data, what was known about the site and the people who lived at it. As far as the data analysis, the burial site data were then pooled by period. All of the affluent sites from each period were pooled together, and all of the poor sites were pulled together for each period. We then created a larger superset and calculated prevalence data for our stress indicators, cribororbitalia, enamel, hypoplasia, and caries. A higher percentage is bad, and mean height, in which case higher is better, taller is better. The differences between the affluent and the poor samples were calculated as an inequality gap, and we reported these as confidence intervals. So for our first indicator, cribororbitalia, this really shows quite well an inequality gap fluctuating over time. And actually, this fits really well with our hypotheses about how we expected inequality to rise and fall in association with social inequality. So there is a health inequality gap in the Roman period. This narrows during the early medieval period, and then it just continues to expand from the later medieval to the post-medieval Victorian period. What's interesting about this is the affluent rates of cribororbitalia stay pretty stable over time. It's actually changes in the environment and in the conditions in which the poor are living over time that seem to be affecting the gap. For caries, or tooth decay, we have a similar picture. It's not quite the same. What we actually have is very much the same situation of inequality favoring the affluent in the Roman period, disappearing during the early medieval, and then a gap that is maintained between the later medieval and post-medieval and Victorian period. But what we have actually is more change in both the affluent and the poor. But within that, we see them moving in the same sorts of directions with tooth decay. But overall, there is a consistent health inequality that favors the affluent. For enamel hypoplasia, which you would recall is defects in the tooth enamel that happen during acute periods of stress, this one is a little bit less clear. We have a clear favoring of the affluent in the Roman period. Again, it disappears for the early medieval period, but in the later medieval period, everyone's rates of enamel hypoplasia go up, and actually it is the poor who have slightly better situation there. And this is potentially perplexing. However, I would interpret this, keeping in mind that this is an acute indicator of stress and you must survive it in order to form this lesion. I suspect what's actually going on here is this is the period where we have the Black Death and famines and a lot of disruption in the later medieval period. So I am suspicious that actually this is not saying that the wealthy were less well off than the poor. This is probably indicating that they were more likely, the wealthy more likely to survive these incidents. It again returns in the post-medieval period to favoring the affluent. Adult stature, slightly more perplexing still. Now, female stature is fairly standard over time. It doesn't change a great deal. What's happening is that the poor stature is moving around a great deal. Now, I would say more than not, there does seem to be an advantage in height to the affluent. However, for the early medieval period, the poor appear to be taller. Now, this may have a lot of explanations. It could be that this is a particularly difficult period to sort individuals by site and summarize because there's a lot of variability within cemeteries as much as between them. It could also be that perhaps early life care was not as good for affluent kids. there's a lot of possibilities, and I think we need to dig into this a little bit more. But overall, I would say there does appear to be an advantage in height. And we probably need to look at that early medieval period a little closer. We have a similar situation for males. Overall, there is an advantage in height to affluent males. The exception is being the Roman period, where affluent males are shorter. Now, this may have something to do with the Roman Empire. Bioarchaeological work has pulled up that childhoods in the Roman Empire were much more stressful, and people who lived other places in the Roman Empire were more likely to be shorter than people who grew up in Roman Britain. So this may be an aspect of higher social status representing people who grew up outside of Britain and geographic mobility. But again, something that would be interesting to look into at greater detail. Conclusions we've got. I think from this work, we can show that bioarchaeology is a really useful tool to provide some insights into past inequalities. Some historians, some demographers and economists have questioned whether health inequalities did exist in the past. And I think our data suggests that it probably did. And I think we probably have a good tool here to be able to dig in a little deeper and try and figure out what the factors were that decreased or increased these things. We can also see that health inequality falls and rises broadly in line with economic and social inequality, just as it does in the present. We found that it fell after the Romans left Britain and rose again during the later Middle Ages and Industrial Revolution period, in line with how we saw widening social inequality. I think environment is another thing that's important to consider, that greater economic and social inequality, when it's put together with worse environmental conditions, that's when it really matters. And that's when we start to see larger health inequality between the affluent and poor groups. And also that this opens some really exciting new avenues for pandisciplinary research and cooperation between disciplines, as we all have different things. We've gotten a lot out of working together as a pandisciplinary team and the different perspectives that that brings. It does also raise some unanswered questions, which we would like to look into a little further. One of the obvious ones, why is the stature gap inconsistent? We have theories about this, but this really needs more data to be able to investigate why we have these anomalous differences in stature in different periods. Another one, which is a big question in history and health economics as well, what role do catastrophic events like plagues and famines, do these increase or do they reduce health inequality overall? What roles do catastrophes play? We're currently in the midst of a worldwide pandemic. And the argument is quite valid that actually these things fall hardest on the least privileged members of society. But what are the larger overall effects of these things? And then finally, how did the historical causes of health inequality differ from how we're experiencing it now? So these historical differences in health inequality, which we would mostly tie to infectious disease potentially, are they different than what we see now, where chronic disease tends to be one of the biggest challenges, and trying to bridge differences in life expectancy between the most and the least privileged members of society? So these are all questions that really sort of bear more examination and are really a fertile area for research, and I think for future inquiry. And bioarchaeology really is a brilliant tool for getting into some of these things. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Ellen. That's absolutely fascinating stuff. We have a few questions in the chat box already, but can I encourage our audience to put any more questions for Ellen in the Q&A box at any time, and we'll come back to Ellen at the end as well. So just to pick on a few, there are a couple of questions around height and the whole thing about whether stature is due to wealth or stress or other anomalies like genetics and other factors. So could you talk us through the relationship between stress or between stature and other things, including your potential inequality hypothesis?
Yes. So growth is something that it doesn't, we sort of think, we think about growth curves, and I think sometimes that can lead us to think that growth is a continual process, and it's really not. Children grow in spurts. They have periods of growth, and then they have periods of not growing a great deal. What can happen when people are living under stress is that the growth periods can be shorter, the growth can be less intense, and you can have longer periods of non-growth in between. Now, if things change, you can catch up in growth, and sometimes that's why your final adult stature may not. If you have short periods of stress, it may not actually impact on your final stature. A lot of it is tied to nutrition as well, and I think for the past this can be really difficult to disentangle. Poor nutrition means you don't grow as well. High, infectious disease load may mean you're under a lot of stress as well. You may be under a lot of psychosocial stress as well, and those things can impinge on growth as well. And unfortunately, if you're living with one, you may well be living with multiple elements on that. One thing that archaeologists are doing that they haven't done in the past is look at more than adult stature and try and look at elements of the skeleton that grow at different times. So some parts of the skeleton may be done growing earlier than others. And if we can look at how well earlier forming elements grew compared to ones that have more time to catch up, we can kind of catch which parts of the lifespan are more, where we don't see any changes in the final stature. We may be able to pick up, is there early stress? Is there stress during adolescence? Is this something that's mostly happening with adults? So we can pick up on those things and try and disentangle some of the elements, but also there's other methods like stable isotope analysis where we can do biochemical analyses and look at diet. So we can look at how much protein people have in their diets and so forth, and we can try and tease apart some of these why are people not growing. Okay,
thank you very much, Ellen. Fascinating. There are a couple of questions about the patterns over time. So in particular, why did some of the differences disappear in early medieval times, and why did that gap grow since the Middle Ages instead of falling? Just generally talk us again through some of those patterns of inequality gaps.
Yeah, I mean, this really fits fairly well with what we hypothesized would happen, since health inequality tends to be tied to social inequality. The changes that occurred between the Roman and the early medieval period, there are some fairly significant changes in lifestyle happening between those periods. Roman Britain was quite urban, very socially stratified. You've got different layers of social stratification. You've got military hierarchies. You've got sort of the tribal hierarchies. You've got the imperial hierarchy as well. And people very much have their place. You also have a situation where many of the rural areas are poorer and they're supplying the food to the wealthier towns, for instance. So this is one of the reasons we think why health is poor in the Roman period. In the early medieval period, there's a real decline in urbanism and most people are living in rural situations. So the overall environment improves quite a lot. And it may be that social inequality decreased. It may also mean that social inequality didn't matter so much to health because everyone was doing better.
Interesting, thank you. That takes us on quite nicely to a question around rural and urban, and Ruth asked, are there variations in results from the rural poor and urban poor after the Industrial Revolution? Maybe that's too near in time for your analysis.
Yeah, I mean, it ends up, that's something I think we would like to dig into a little bit further. There are not as many sites available, unfortunately, for the rural poor in many cases because archaeology is tied to development. We don't, not since the Victorian period anyway, we don't dig things up just because we're interested in them. They usually tend to be excavated because of development. So there's less development occurring in rural areas. So a lot of archaeology is not intentional, it's a rescue operation. So we tend to have a lot more sites from urban. We do tend to see better health at the rural sites in the sort of post-medieval period than we do in cities. Certainly the urban poor had the absolute worst of it. They had very poor health in a lot of cases, not only poor nutrition, but also lots and lots of deficiencies and things that are even tied to sunlight, lots of rickets.
Okay. Yeah. Fascinating, thanks. We've just got a couple more minutes for questions from you, and I know I'm not going to be able to get to all of the questions, so maybe we'll come back to some of them at the end. So first of all, a fairly quick one. Are you aware of similar research done anywhere other than England?
Not there. Yeah, there has been similar work done other places, and I was trying to remember the one that. Yes, there has been similar work done. I don't know that it's been done in quite the same way. Now, this is more of a proof of concept study that we've done. It hasn't been done quite in the same way as other ones. We've also had there's other studies that have been done over long periods of time in Britain, but not with the express aim of looking at health inequality. So what we've done is reasonably unusual in the way we've done it. But yes, I am aware of other work.
Could I just say one thing there to top that up? And basically, most previous studies have just looked at one point in time and said, oh, there's inequality. What's new here is comparing the trends over long periods of time. And I don't think it has been done.
Okay, very interesting. Thank you very much.
But it could.
My last question for Ellen, and then we'll move on to you, Richard. Have no fear. So is it possible to do an intra-elite comparison between the Roman elite and the Britain, the native elite in Roman times?
I think the difficulty would be trying to distinguish between a Romanized native elite, because I think the tendency was for the tribal elite that were already there. A lot of them worked hand in glove with the Romans, and they became quite Romanized in their lifestyle. So I think you'd have to be able to identify individuals in that way. Yeah. And I think that might be quite tricky.
Okay, fair enough. Interesting question though. Whoever that one was.
No, it is. I'm actually trying to think about ways possibly.
There you go. One to ponder while Richard's talking. Thanks so much, Ellen. I know I haven't asked all the questions that are on the Q&A, so we'll maybe come back to some of those later. But in the meantime, let me hand over to Richard Cookson, Professor Richard Cookson, to take us into more modern times.
Thanks, Ellen. I mean, Ellen's stuff is a lot more interesting than my stuff, and I'm looking forward to continuing to work with her. But I will just say a little bit about current inequalities that are going on now in COVID times, and also I'll take you on a little fictional journey into the future to think about what might happen in the next 1,000 years to health inequality, just to sort of tease you a bit and get you thinking about what might happen in the future. I'm going to talk about health inequality today and tomorrow, and health inequality today. Well, let's have a look at this. This is a pre-COVID, just shortly pre-COVID. This is Norway versus the United States. On the horizontal axis, you've got income percentile. You know, you're ranking households by their wealth, but well, their income, household income. And on the vertical axis, we've got life expectancy at age 40 for men. And we see a steep social gradient in life expectancy, which is absolutely standard. You could draw thousands of pictures like this. Basically, if you take any health indicator, shove it on the vertical axis, and any indicator of social status, you shove it on the horizontal axis, you end up with a picture that looks a bit like this. But what's really interesting here is that if you look at the gap between the top and the bottom, it's quite similar. So the very poorest people here are about 74 life expectancy, and the very richest quite similar, 86 or so. But what's interesting is in Norway, you're better off in the middle. So you don't get such a steep social gradient. And so basically you only really start having this sort of almost cliff edge. You start getting worse off, at the bottom 10% and the bottom 5%. So in a way, Norway is a much more equal society than the United States in terms of wealth, income, all sorts of other things. But they still have big inequalities between the very top and the bottom. But what you can achieve by having a more equal society, and at least in modern times, is you make things better for the large sweep of the population, but you still end up with a certain number of people who are suffering at the bottom there. That seems to be the message from that picture. Here's a picture from this country, actually from England, and what this shows is life expectancy at birth this time. This is by 10 groups of socioeconomic deprivation based on your neighborhood. And what we can see clearly here is that there's a very clear social gradient, that the bottom line is the most deprived, the worst of people. The top line is the most advantaged, 10th of people in this country. And over time, everyone is slightly increasing. But what you'll notice, so this is between 2000 and 2017-19. It's just before the current COVID play. I will get to COVID in a minute, I promise. But what you'll see slightly worrying, this is women. So what you see slightly worryingly is that the gap is increasing a little bit over time. And look how life expectancy is flattening, certainly for the poorest groups. So that's a very worrying trend that, over the last 150 years, life expectancy has been growing every year. So suddenly we've got this flattening of life expectancy growth, not just in England, but in a whole bunch of high income countries. And so that's quite a worrying sign. And, as ever, it tends to be the poorer groups that suffer most from these things. So now on to COVID. Here are some pictures from my colleague, Tim Doran, and Evan Kontopoulos from Manchester and their colleagues. And what they've done is they've just plotted death rates, it's called excess mortality. So this is the mortality from every cause. And the blue line over time is what you'd expect, comparing the last 5 years, and the red line is what we observed during COVID. And you can see these two massive spikes here. COVID is killing, but also it's the other stuff. It's the hospitals are closing down, and people are not doing stuff, and they're having heart attacks and dying and so on without getting the right treatment and so on. So there's a big excess mortality. But look at the spike. If you look at the spike in the most deprived group of the population, the most deprived fifth, is much higher. So they've suffered a much bigger burden. The most deprived people in this country have suffered a much bigger burden from COVID. And then when you look at some, graphs, some further graphs of that sort of thing, you get the same picture there. You see this typical social gradient picture that more deprived groups are suffering a larger burden of excess mortality. This is the rate of death, or the rate of excess mortality per 100,000 people, both from COVID and from other causes. Now, actually, it's closely related to the baseline risk of dying. You could, roughly speaking, COVID gives you an extra risk of dying that's some proportion, of your current risk of dying. It gives you, I think, about 15% extra risk of dying over that year period. And so what that means is if you're more likely to die anyway, let's say you're older, or if you've got various comorbidities, you're unhealthy and from a poorer social background, you've got a higher risk of dying anyway, and COVID just increases your risk. So overall, that's one of the key reasons why deprived, more disadvantaged people have a higher burden in absolute terms of death rate. But it's even more than proportional, particularly because of the exposure risk. Deprived people are doing low-skilled jobs and so on, and getting more exposed to the virus. So it's actually even worse than proportional, the effect of the pandemic. And one of the issues, so basically this particular pandemic has basically hit the poor harder, for sure. And we think that in history as well, pandemics tend to hit the poor harder. One of the reasons is that rich people are able to sort of move around and escape from the most dangerous areas and the most dangerous jobs and so on. But in history, a slightly different thing happened. In history, when you get things like Black Plagues, lots of people die. Literally half the population died from the Black Plague. And after the population dies, what happens then is people are basically richer. They've got more land. So actually, inequality in the surviving population tends to fall. That's one of the historical hypotheses. So pandemics historically have had sort of short term, they increase health inequality, in the long term they reduce health inequality. That's one hypothesis. Anyway, sorry, back to the present. this dismal picture. This is a picture of differences by region in England, and you can see that in the north you get a higher burden than the south. These sorts of pictures. So that's again, so those of us who studied health inequalities for years, not very surprising results. I mean, bad, but we see these sorts of things before. Okay, so what can we do about it in the future? How can we, change these dismal pictures in the future? Well, first of all, we have to understand why these things are happening. And here's a quick picture. I don't really have much time to go into it, but here's a quick, it's called the social determinants of health perspective. And, very interdisciplinary, a lot of interdisciplinary research on this, but basically you start with the general environment and inequalities of wealth and power in society. And then you start from the beginning of life, in utero, when the fetus is forming, things are happening to the fetus that are socially patterned. And so basically you've got the family and community are influencing what happens to your childhood development. You've got physical growth, cognitive skills, social skills, cultural skills being developed. And these then feed through both into your wealth, your education, employment and wealth, and they feed through into your health. And in between, you've got wealth, changing your living conditions and experiences, then changing your health behaviors, and that affects your health. But if you get sick, particularly in the modern world, if you get mental illness, you've got lower earnings potential, and then you gradually slide down the social scale. And so health has a feedback effect into wealth. So there's all sorts of complicated causal pathways that take a long time going on here. And it's a complicated picture, but we suspect that the causes here in fundamental terms probably haven't changed that much over the millennia. And that's why we see these pictures that Ellen has been showing us, that we see these inequalities at most periods during human history, although not so much in the early medieval period, which is very interesting. And we need to look at that more closely. Anyway, so that's the sort of causal pathways going on here. Let's think, well, given that, how can we break some of those causal pathways and make things better? What's going to happen in the future? So, inevitably, looking thousands of years ahead is a slightly silly game, really. Anything can happen, but I'll give you some possible scenarios. So here we are. Here's scenario one, optimistic scenario, imagining that human lifespan is fixed at about 100, at what? Some studies say it's 150 under current technology. I've been a little bit less ambitious than this. I'm assuming that it's fixed at about 100, 140. And so what we see here is the rich with improved diet and so on zoom ahead. The average is also zooming, and the poor are also catching up, but there's this continual gap between them. So that's one possible, quite optimistic scenario. Some people would say, well, hang on, why are you assuming continued economic growth and continued technological improvement and so on? Aren't we going to have also, isn't the world heading to hell in a handcart? Well, possibly. And here's another more doomsday scenario for you. This is what might happen to health inequality if we have an environmental catastrophe in 50 to 100 years' time. Yes, you're going to eliminate health inequality, but you do it by everyone dying, which is probably not the best way of doing it. So that could happen. That is possible. And so health inequality and climate are very, very much linked in both directions. So obviously climate change will influence people's health, but crucially the inequalities in wealth you see around the globe influence our chances of actually tackling climate change, because you have to redistribute a bit of income if people are expected to live in environmentally friendly ways and not have massive growth in population, which causes a lot of carbon. Okay, so that's a climate change doomsday scenario. Here's a third scenario for you. What if we have a biotech revolution? This is science fiction, but it's not impossible. What if amazing, the human brain really zooms ahead and develops sort of cyborgs and nanotechnology and stem cells and all this stuff? We actually extend human lifespan beyond 150. And then you get a possible dystopian situation where wealthy people with access to these amazing cyborg technologies zoom ahead, right? They could achieve lifespans of 150, 200, who knows, they could zoom ahead. Whereas people without access to that, they're stuck at a life expectancy of, I don't know what it would be, let's say 100 here. But you could get very much widening health inequalities because of access to technology, as technology becomes more and more important. And as Ellen was showing, in the past, it was not so much technology as basic nutrition, environmental poisoning. She wasn't mentioning lead poisoning, but there's all sorts of basic issues in the past, about that improve your health. But increasingly in the future, as technology expands, it'll be access to technology. So it's very important that in the future we make sure that more disadvantaged people get access to these technologies. How do we do that? Well, here's my little spiel for the kind of work that I do. At the moment, decision makers, when they're thinking about funding for health services, but other things as well, they tend to look at averages. They only look at the average benefits of a technology or of a policy that they're deciding upon. What we need to do is split that into the rainbow. We need to show who gains and who loses from decisions in terms of their health, split out that white light into the rainbow so that we know who is gaining the most, and we try to make sure that more disadvantaged populations are not left behind from social change and from decisions, and we make sure that everyone in society is benefiting from new technology and economic growth and so on and so forth. So the idea is to start doing what I call distributional analysis of policies in terms of their health effects, not just in terms of money. Money is important and so on, but health and well-being that's what really matters. And so we should be analysing policies in terms of that. And we've developed various methods at York to do that. This is what I call, this is the equity efficiency impact plane. This is a simple way of describing it to decision makers. Normally we focus on the vertical axis, which is the average benefit of a policy in terms of cost effectiveness or total impact. But what we need to do is add the horizontal axis. We need to see, is it increasing health inequality or is it reducing health inequality? And we need to adjust our policies in order to get to that win-win quadrant where it's reducing health inequality. All too often there are policies which inadvertently increase health inequalities, and we need to spot those and redesign them. And sometimes we need to do things that are not necessarily cost effective or good on average according to normal standards. We need to do things that are, we have to make a bit of a sacrifice as a population in order to reduce health inequalities and help more disadvantaged people. At least that's the ethical idea there. Okay, so that's the kind of work that we're doing, and there's books and so on about it. I won't bore you with that. So I think I'm just going to pause there and see if we get any questions on that. And you're very welcome to ask questions if you find all this stuff, passe and so on. I'm very happy for you to ask more questions to Ellen about the history stuff. So I'll hand over there to Karen.
Okay, thanks very much, Richard. That's great. So a couple of questions for you, and then I've got one or two that I think will apply to both of you. Just for clarification, really, what do you mean by technology in your scenarios? What technology are you thinking of that's going to have that much impact on people's health? Particularly biotechnology. You can rebuild human bodies. You can create cyborgs. I mean, there are incredible things that are going on. They haven't sorted out the brain yet, but almost every other organ can be regrown. So amazing. And the point is, I know it sounds like science fiction now, but just think about what was thought possible even 50 years ago. Crazy things can happen. Okay, that's fascinating. And so Michael from our audience has asked, have any particular policies so far stood out as being particularly promising in terms of distributional analysis? So which policies have improved equity so far? Do you mean the biggest improvements in equity? I mean, the most important thing that was done in the 2000s by the Blair and Brown government was they spent basically they spent a lot more money on public services, which tend to benefit the poorer people. It's as simple as that. You've got to increase public services, particularly and trying to make them, targeting them towards the poorer, disadvantaged groups who need them. So particularly in primary care, they spent a lot of money on, having more GPs in deprived areas. I mean, now, it's back to flat funding, and you've got the same number of GPs
everywhere in the country. But of course, you need more GPs in deprived areas because they're sicker. So that's just one example. But yeah, that's that. I mean, I think it's quite simple, really. It's about more public spending on quality services. Yeah.
Thank you. So on the flip side of that, can you give an example of a recent medical development that's had a negative effect on equality or equity?
Well, what happens a lot in public health, with sort of screening programs, it tends to be wealthier people who take it up faster. I mean, we sort of see that with vaccination. It tends to be there are great, the anti-vax movements tend to be more popular among less educated and so on populations. So a lot of public health things that require behavior change and effort to do are harder because people have different environments, different skill sets and so on. And so, yeah, so a lot of public health things have that effect. And so one needs to redesign these programs to make it easier for more disadvantaged people to take them up. That would be one example.
Okay. And Michelle asked, is this the kind of distributional analysis new, and is it something that the current government embraces or not?
Well, it's been developed over the last sort of 10 years in health. I mean, distribution analysis has been done for years at budget day. You'll notice the budget, they tell you over the next 2 or 3 years, who gains, who loses in terms of money. So that's been done for donkey's years. But health and well-being distribution analysis is new. And there is interest now after COVID, that COVID has shed a light on these. I mean, people like me and Ellen have been studying these things for years. We know that these health inequalities exist, but this has really shed a light on it. And there is signs that the government is interested and may start moving in this direction. I hope they will, but who knows? Okay,
we'll look out for it. Thank you. Can I ask a question of both of you? This again was from Michael. He said that when seeing a finding that seemingly goes against your initial hypothesis, and the example was for Ellen, affluent men being shorter than poorer ones in Roman times, what tests or what thought processes do you go through to work out whether this is an anomaly or whether your whole hypothesis is wrong? And I think both of you can have a stab at that one, but let's go to Ellen first because it was directed at you.
I think firstly, you do accept that, this is a fairly broad brush technique that we've used with summary data here. This is just phase one, so that's one thing. I think in terms of interpreting it, you have to align it with what you know of the context and see, can I make any sense of it, in terms of the historical trajectory that we're looking at and what else we know. If you can't, I don't think you certainly don't try and bend your hypothesis to fit that, but it is something that we already know that we would like to look at this in greater detail. That's something you're going to target with your second phase of methodology so that you can untangle some of these things. So for instance, if we hypothesize that maybe this is migration influencing, it might be worth doing some isotopes that look at whether people did migrate. If it's a question of maybe they were under greater stress in childhood, maybe we look at the body proportions and the places where there might be signs of early stress in those skeletons. So you follow it up further. I think at the minute, these are just early findings. So it's trying to make a sense of it in terms of maybe this could explain it. To confirm that, we need more data, I think. But it's still hypothesis.
Okay, Richard, what about you? How would you be convinced that you were wrong?
Well, I mean, this is a great question, and I guess this is all about science, isn't it? I mean, we need our anomalies. That's how we learn and understand. So what you don't do is just say, oh well, just ignore it and cover it up. We really do want to understand it, and it could be something really important. A gross violation of the usual causal pathways. Maybe there wasn't social inequality in Roman times. Now, I still doubt that. I suspect it's something more interesting and subtle. But so my thought process is dig into. I mean, you churn out as many hypotheses as you can, and then you test them. Right? You need evidence on them, and you have to think of ingenious ways of testing them using maybe creative different bits of data. What else can I say? I think that's it. But anyway, thanks for that. I mean, whoever asked that question, great question. Thank you for that. We'll do our best. We'll do our best in 2 or 3 years' time to answer that one. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. And just one on causal pathways, which I think again might be appropriate for both of you. Dill and Can have both asked basically why being poor makes you have worse health, and Can was particularly interested in diet. And does diet have a big influence on life expectancy? And you know, the population that grew up in the sort of post-war period had a different diet to that we have now in terms of sugar and ultra-processed food and that kind of thing. So just a really simple question with probably not a simple answer, but why does being poor make you have worse health, and what are some of those real mechanisms?
Do you want to go first, Richard, or should I?
Well, you know, how long have you got? But I mean, the diagram I showed is kind of. I didn't go through the diagram. You know, there's a lot of complex sorts of. But look, basically, it's the conditions of daily life are bad. If the conditions of daily life are bad, that causes all sorts of stresses and problems for your body and your behaviour, and that causes you to maybe smoke, drink, and do all these other things. But it's throughout the whole of life, right from childhood, the stresses chronically build up. That's the main pathway, but then there's the reverse causation pathway. If you get sick, you can't earn money, you can't maintain your high social status. And so both directions are going on. Ellen, over to you.
Yeah, it's funny because I had a chat with a friend the other day, and I told her the talk that we were going to be doing, and she went straight to diet. And I think she wanted me to say that it was diet, because I think a lot of people really want to sort of reduce things to diet. It's because we eat too many processed foods today. And I think it's easy to think of things that way. And yes, that is a problem of modern life, but you can't really say that for the past, where everybody ate literally organic food all the time. This is not what's going on. I think it's all these other things that maybe are less comfortable, especially if people are middle class, to think about the realities of being poor. If you have to worry about where your next meal is coming from, that's stress. If you have to worry about whether you're going to have a roof over your head, that's stress. If you have to worry that your neighborhood isn't safe and you're going to get attacked. So unfortunately, people who live in poverty live under chronic stress. That affects your immune system, that affects it creates oxidative stress in your body that can impact on cardiac function. Stress is literally a killer. So we've got that element of it as well. But also there's the element of maternal health and what sort of conditions are expectant mothers living in, and the sort of, you know, the fetal period and infancy are these priming periods. What kind of conditions are we supporting mothers are they having healthy pregnancies? Are they stressed during their pregnancy? How are we helping them, you know, in the early postnatal period? How are they supported to feed their babies? You know, and all of these things are coming in, and yes, I mean, nutrition plays a really big role, but it's part of a much bigger web of, you know, overall, we're social and biological creatures, and these things are pinging off of each other. And like Richard says, the financial aspect of it as well, your health is impacting on your socioeconomic status, and your socioeconomic status is impacting on your health, and it's just feeding. So
I know we have
complicated.
I know we have to finish. Let me just use one phrase that Sir Michael Marmot uses, which is very useful. Diet is a cause of health inequality, but also look at the causes of the causes. Why are people having bad diets? And there are deeper reasons. Okay.
Thank you both very much. That was really fascinating. And thank you both for your talks. I think, as you say, Richard, we're going to have to wind up. We're a little bit over time already. Before we finish, please, everyone, remember that the recording of this event will be available on the festival YouTube channel, which can be accessed from the Watch Again section of the festival website after the 20th of June. You'll be contacted by email when the video is available to view. We do hope that you'll continue to engage with York Festival of Ideas. Check out the website, that's yorkfestivalofideas.com, all one word for York Festival of Ideas. And you'll find full details of all of the events in the festival programme. There's some really fascinating events, do check it out. We'd love to hear your thoughts on these events, continue the conversations using your social media of choice, and please use the hashtag your ideas. So thank you very much to Ellen and Richard for great talks this evening. Thank you all for joining us and for asking such fascinating questions too. Have a great evening, everyone.